The humid, August air hung thick over Houston as Michael Torres wiped the sweat from his brow and adjusted his cab's air conditioning. It was nearly 11 p.m. on August 15th, 1997, and he'd been driving for almost 14 hours straight, hoping to make enough money to cover his youngest daughter's school fees. The radio crackled with dispatcher calls as he pulled up to the Marriott downtown, where a well-dressed passenger was waiting under the bright hotel lights. The man slid into the back seat without making eye contact, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with the worn vinyl interior of the yellow cab. "Where to?" Michael asked, catching a glimpse of his passenger in the rearview mirror. The man appeared nervous, constantly checking his watch and glancing out the rear window, as if expecting to be followed. "Highway 6 South," came the terse reply. "I'll give you directions once we're moving." Michael nodded and pulled away from the curb, navigating through the late-night traffic of downtown Houston. He'd been driving cabs for 12 years, ever since moving to Texas from New Mexico with his wife Rosa and their twin daughters. In all that time, he'd developed an instinct for reading passengers, and something about this fare made his skin crawl. The man's hand shook slightly as he lit a cigarette, despite the no smoking sign prominently displayed in the cab. Before we continue following Michael into what would become one of Houston's most baffling mysteries, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps bring these important stories to light. Now let's return to that fateful night that would change everything for the Torres family. As they left the bright lights of the city center behind, Michael tried to make conversation, as was his habit with passengers. "Business trip?" he asked, but received only a grunt in response. The man continued chain-smoking, filling the cab with an acrid haze that made Michael's eyes water. They passed through increasingly desolate areas of the city, where abandoned warehouses and industrial complexes stretched into the darkness like sleeping giants from Houston's industrial past. 20 minutes into the ride, the passenger directed Michael to take an exit that led to an area of the city he rarely visited. The Eastside Industrial District was a maze of chemical plants, shipping facilities, and manufacturing buildings that had seen better days. Many of the businesses had closed down in the early 1990s recession, leaving behind empty structures that served as reminders of the city's changing economic landscape. The streetlights were sporadic here, creating pools of yellow illumination separated by stretches of impenetrable darkness. "Turn left at the next intersection," the passenger commanded, his voice now carrying an edge that made Michael's hands tighten on the steering wheel. They were deep in an area where legitimate businesses closed at sunset, and the only people who had reason to be here after dark were usually up to no good. Michael had heard stories from other drivers about passengers who used cabs to conduct illegal business, and he was beginning to suspect he'd stumbled into exactly that kind of situation. The meter was approaching $60 when the passenger finally told him to stop in front of a chain-link fence surrounding what appeared to be an abandoned chemical processing plant. The sign by the gate was so faded and rust-stained that Michael couldn't make out what company had once operated here. Beyond the fence, he could see several large buildings with broken windows and equipment that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The place had an ominous quality that made him want to finish this fare quickly and get back to the safety of busier streets. "This is it," the passenger said, but instead of reaching for his wallet, he produced something that made Michael's blood run cold. The small pistol gleamed dully in the dim light from the dashboard, and the man's previously nervous demeanor had been replaced by cold calculation. "Turn off the engine and put your hands where I can see them." Michael's mind immediately went to his daughters, Isabella and Lucia, who were only 7 years old and still believed their father was invincible. He thought about Rosa, who would be waiting up for him, despite his protests that she should get her sleep. She always worried when he worked late shifts, especially in the rougher parts of the city. His hands trembled slightly as he turned off the ignition, the sudden silence in the cab making the sound of his own heartbeat seem unnaturally loud. "What do you want?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice steady. In 12 years of driving, he'd been robbed twice, but both times the thieves had been desperate drug addicts looking for quick cash. This felt different, more professional, more dangerous. The gunman studied Michael's reflection in the rearview mirror with the detached interest of someone evaluating livestock. "You picked up the wrong fare tonight, friend. Sometimes that's all it takes to change everything." He gestured toward the abandoned plant with his free hand. "See that place? Used to make industrial solvents until the EPA shut them down for dumping chemicals in the groundwater. But the cleanup was never completed properly. Amazing how things can just disappear in places like that." Meanwhile, across town, in their modest house in the Gulfton neighborhood, Rosa Torres was pacing the kitchen floor and checking the clock above the stove for the 15th time in an hour. Michael was usually good about calling during his breaks, especially on long shifts, but tonight the phone had remained stubbornly silent. She'd already put the girls to bed, reading them their favorite story about a brave knight who always found his way home, no matter how dark the forest became. Now she found herself wondering if she should call the cab company or wait a little longer. The dispatcher's office at Yellow Cab was experiencing one of those busy Friday nights that kept everyone running from call to call. Supervisor Jimmy Rodriguez noticed that Michael Torres hadn't checked in for over 2 hours, which was unusual for one of their most reliable drivers. Michael had a reputation for following protocols religiously, always keeping dispatch informed of his location and status. Rodriguez tried raising him on the radio several times, but got only static in response. He made a note in the logbook, but decided to wait until the shift change before taking any formal action. Back at the industrial complex, the gunman forced Michael out of the cab at gunpoint. The abandoned chemical plant loomed before them like something from a nightmare, its broken windows staring down at them like empty eye sockets. The man appeared to be in his early 30s, with the kind of cold, calculating eyes that suggested violence was a familiar tool in his repertoire. He moved with the confidence of someone who had done this before, someone for whom human life held little value beyond its potential to create problems. "Here's how this is going to work," the gunman said, circling the cab with predatory patience. "You're going to tell me everything you remember about picking me up tonight, every detail, every conversation, everyone who might have seen us together. Then we're going to take a little walk inside that plant, and you're going to help me solve a problem." Michael's survival instincts kicked in as he realized the gravity of his situation. This wasn't a simple robbery that would end with him losing a night's earnings. The man's casual reference to making him disappear suggested this was something far more sinister. He began searching for any opportunity to escape, any momentary distraction that might give him a chance to run or fight back. The industrial complex was huge and full of places to hide, if he could just get away from the gun long enough to reach them. "I don't know anything about you or what you're involved in," Michael said, trying to buy time while scanning their surroundings for anything he could use as a weapon or shield. "I just pick up fares and drop them off. I've got 2 little girls at home who need their father. Whatever this is about, I swear I'll never say a word to anyone." The gunman laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. That's exactly what someone would say if they were planning to run straight to the police. He pulled out a cell phone and checked the time. "Unfortunately for you, my employers don't believe in taking chances with loose ends. They prefer permanent solutions to temporary problems." As if summoned by his words, the sound of another vehicle approaching echoed through the night air. Headlights swept across the entrance to the complex, and both men could see a dark van pulling through the gate. The gunman's expression shifted from cold professionalism to something approaching satisfaction, as if the arrival of reinforcements had confirmed that everything was proceeding according to plan. Michael realized this might be his last chance to act. As the gunman momentarily turned his attention toward the approaching vehicle, Michael lunged toward the open door of his cab. His fingers found the radio microphone, and he managed to key the transmit button before a gunshot exploded in the night air. The bullet shattered the cab's rear window, sending glass fragments cascading across the pavement like deadly rain. "Dispatch! This is Torres in cab 47, Michael shouted into the radio as he dove behind the vehicle for cover. "I'm at some kind of chemical plant on the east side. Armed passenger, shots fired, need immediate backup." He wasn't sure if his message had gotten through clearly, but at least he'd tried to alert the outside world to his situation. The van had stopped about 50 yards away, and Michael could see two more figures climbing out. They moved with military precision, spreading out to flank his position behind the cab. These weren't street criminals or desperate addicts. They were professionals who clearly had experience in this kind of work. The realization sent a chill through Michael's body that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "You just made this a lot more complicated," the original gunman called out, his voice echoing off the empty buildings around them. "My friends don't like complications. They tend to respond to them with extreme prejudice." Michael tried to start the cab's engine, hoping to ram his way through the fence and escape onto the street. But when he turned the key, nothing happened. One of the bullets had apparently damaged something vital under the hood, leaving him stranded in hostile territory with nowhere to run. The irony wasn't lost on him. The reliable yellow cab that had never failed him in 12 years of service had chosen this moment to let him down. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as the three armed men began coordinating their movements to surround his position. Michael could hear them communicating through some kind of radio system, their voices professional and emotionless as they discussed angles of approach and fields of fire. Whatever organization they worked for had trained them well in the art of making people disappear without leaving traces behind. From his hiding spot behind the cab, Michael could see that the abandoned chemical plant offered multiple potential escape routes. If he could reach the main building, he might be able to lose himself in the maze of corridors and industrial equipment inside. But getting there would require crossing about 30 yards of open ground, while three armed professionals were actively hunting him. The odds weren't encouraging, but staying put meant certain death. Drawing on reserves of courage he didn't know he possessed, Michael broke from cover and sprinted toward the plant's main entrance. Gunshots erupted behind him, bullets whining off concrete and metal as he zigzagged desperately through the obstacle course of abandoned machinery and chemical storage tanks. One round caught him in the left shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a rusted conveyor belt. But adrenaline kept him moving toward the building's dark interior. Inside the plant, Michael found himself in an industrial cathedral of shadows and echoes. Moonlight filtered through broken skylights, creating pools of silver illumination among the massive chemical processing equipment that still filled the facility. The air smelled of rust, decay, and lingering chemical residues that made his throat burn. But the building's complex layout offered numerous hiding places and potential escape routes if he could stay ahead of his pursuers long enough to find them. The wound in his shoulder was bleeding steadily, leaving a trail that his hunters could easily follow. Michael tore a strip of fabric from his shirt and tried to create a makeshift bandage, but he knew he was fighting a losing battle against blood loss and shock. His vision was beginning to blur around the edges, and his hands were shaking so badly he could barely manipulate simple objects. Behind him, he could hear the three men entering the building, their footsteps echoing through the cavernous space as they began a systematic search. They had flashlights and moved with tactical discipline, clearing each area methodically before advancing to the next. Michael realized they were driving him deeper into the plant, away from potential exits, herding him like prey toward some predetermined killing ground. At Rosa Torres's house, the phone finally rang at 12:47 a.m. She grabbed it on the first ring, hoping to hear Michael's familiar voice apologizing for working late. Instead, she found herself talking to Jimmy Rodriguez from the cab company, who was trying to sound reassuring while clearly being worried himself. "Mrs. Torres, I'm sure it's nothing serious, but we haven't heard from Michael in about 3 hours. His last check-in was from downtown around 10:30. Rosa's heart sank as her worst fears began to materialize. "That's not like him, Jimmy. Michael always calls if he's going to be late. Something's wrong." She could hear the dispatcher's radio crackling in the background, other drivers checking in from their routes across the sprawling city. But Michael's voice wasn't among them, and its absence created a void that seemed to grow larger with each passing minute. "I've got units looking for his cab," Rodriguez assured her. "And I've already contacted the police to file a missing person report. Michael's one of our best drivers. If he's in some kind of trouble, we're going to find him." But even as he spoke the words, Rodriguez knew the statistics about missing persons cases. The first 24 hours were critical, and they were already burning through precious time. Detective Lawrence Park of the Houston Police Department's Missing Persons Unit took the call at 1:15 a.m. A 22-year veteran of the force, Park had seen enough cases to know that taxi drivers faced unique occupational hazards. They worked alone, dealt with cash, and often found themselves in dangerous neighborhoods during the hours when most decent people were safely asleep. But something about the Torres case bothered him from the beginning. Good family men with steady jobs didn't usually just vanish without explanation. Back in the chemical plant, Michael had managed to reach the building's upper level, where a network of catwalks and maintenance platforms offered elevated hiding places among the industrial machinery. But his shoulder wound was taking its toll, and he was leaving obvious blood traces on everything he touched. The 3 gunmen below had split up to cover more ground, their flashlight beams sweeping methodically through the shadows as they closed in on his position. From his vantage point on the catwalks, Michael could see that one of his pursuers was talking on a cell phone, apparently receiving instructions from someone else. The conversation was too quiet for him to make out specific words, but the tone suggested urgency and growing frustration. Whatever timeline they were operating under, his resistance was disrupting their plans and creating problems for their organization. Michael found himself thinking about the bedtime story he'd promised to tell Isabella and Lucia when he got home. The one about the brave knight who used his wits to overcome impossible odds. He'd always enjoyed making up adventures for his daughters, stories where good ultimately triumphed over evil through courage and determination. Now he was living his own version of that tale, fighting against overwhelming odds for the chance to return to the people he loved most. The sound of metal creaking under footsteps told him that at least one of the gunmen had found a way onto the catwalks. Michael moved as quietly as possible through the maze of pipes and machinery, but his injured shoulder made stealth difficult. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his body, and he could feel his strength ebbing with each step. Time was running out, and he knew he needed to find either an escape route or a place to make his final stand. That's when he spotted it. A service tunnel that led from the processing level toward what looked like the plant's old water treatment facility. The opening was partially concealed behind a control panel, and it appeared to be large enough for a person to crawl through. More importantly, it seemed to lead away from the main building toward the perimeter fence. If he could reach it without being seen, he might have a chance to escape the industrial complex entirely. Michael waited for the right moment when all 3 flashlight beams were pointed away from his position, then made his move. He half crawled, half slid down a maintenance ladder, biting back a cry of pain as the movement aggravated his shoulder wound. The service tunnel was even smaller than it had appeared from above, forcing him to army crawl through a space barely wide enough for his shoulders. The metal was cold against his skin, and he could hear water dripping somewhere in the darkness ahead. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a claustrophobic nightmare of tight spaces and complete darkness. Michael had never been particularly afraid of enclosed spaces, but the combination of his injury, exhaustion, and the knowledge that armed killers were hunting him made every foot of progress feel like an eternity. He forced himself to keep moving by thinking about Rosa's smile and the way his daughters laughed when he tickled them during their bedtime routine. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Michael saw a faint glimmer of light ahead. The tunnel was opening onto some kind of drainage system that led away from the plant toward the surrounding neighborhood. But as he emerged from the confined space, he realized his escape had come at a cost. The crawl through the tunnel had reopened his shoulder wound, and he was losing blood at an alarming rate. The drainage system carried him about a quarter-mile from the chemical plant before depositing him in a concrete culvert that ran beneath a residential street. Michael hauled himself up onto the sidewalk, his clothes torn and bloody, his face pale from blood loss and shock. He was in a neighborhood he didn't recognize, surrounded by small houses and apartment buildings that showed no signs of life in the pre-dawn darkness. Michael stumbled toward the nearest house with lights still on, a small bungalow where someone was apparently watching late-night television. But before he could reach the front door, exhaustion and blood loss finally overcame him. He collapsed on the front lawn, his last conscious thought being a prayer that someone would find him in time, and that Rosa would know he had fought to come home to her. The homeowner, an elderly man named Walter Gonzalez, discovered Michael's unconscious form when he stepped outside to retrieve his morning newspaper at 5:30 a.m. Gonzalez immediately called 911, and paramedics arrived within minutes to stabilize Michael and transport him to Houston Methodist Hospital. The attending physician, Dr. Rachel Kim, later said that Michael had lost nearly half his blood volume and would have died within another hour if he hadn't been found when he was. When Michael regained consciousness 3 days later, he found himself in a hospital bed surrounded by Rosa, Isabella, and Lucia. The relief on their faces was overwhelming, but he could see the questions in Rosa's eyes, questions about what had happened during the hours he'd been missing, questions about why someone had tried to kill him, questions about whether their family was still in danger from whoever had orchestrated the attack. Detective Park interviewed Michael extensively once his conditions stabilized enough for him to provide a coherent account of his ordeal. The story that emerged was deeply troubling. A professional kidnapping and attempted murder that suggested organized criminal involvement rather than random street crime. The abandoned chemical plant where the attack had occurred was owned by a shell company with connections to several businesses under investigation for environmental crimes and illegal waste disposal. The investigation revealed that Michael's mysterious passenger had been Vincent Chen, a mid-level executive with Apex Environmental Services who had been embezzling money from chemical cleanup projects. Chen had apparently been planning to flee Houston with stolen funds when he made the fatal mistake of involving an innocent taxi driver in his escape plan. Security camera footage from the hotel confirmed Chen's identity, but the man himself had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. The 3 gunmen who had hunted Michael through the chemical plant remained unidentified despite extensive investigation. The weapons used in the attack were never recovered, and the van they'd arrived in had been stolen from a construction company 3 days before the incident. Whoever had employed them had covered their tracks professionally, leaving behind no evidence that could lead back to the people ultimately responsible for ordering Michael's death. Michael's recovery was long and difficult, both physically and emotionally. The shoulder wound healed properly, but he was left with persistent nerve damage that ended his career as a taxi driver. More challenging were the psychological scars, the nightmares, the hypervigilance, the constant fear that his attackers might return to finish what they'd started. Rosa insisted they move to a different neighborhood, somewhere their enemies couldn't easily find them if they decided to try again. The Torres family's ordeal became a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers faced by working people who found themselves unwittingly caught up in criminal enterprises. Michael's story was featured in local newspapers and television news programs, highlighting the risks faced by taxi drivers and other service workers who dealt with anonymous customers during dangerous hours. The coverage helped lead to improved safety protocols for cab companies throughout the Houston metropolitan area. Detective Park never forgot the Torres case, even after his retirement in 2008. He kept copies of all the investigation files, occasionally reviewing them when new information about environmental crime or organized illegal waste disposal surfaced. In his heart, he knew that Vincent Chen was dead, probably killed by the same people who had tried to murder Michael. But without a body or definitive proof, Chen remained officially classified as a missing person. The abandoned chemical plant where Michael had fought for his life was eventually demolished in 2003 as part of an environmental cleanup project. The site was capped with clean soil and converted into a small park with a memorial plaque honoring victims of industrial accidents and environmental crimes. Michael attended the dedication ceremony with his family, finally achieving a measure of closure about the place where he had nearly died. Years later, Michael often reflected on the night that had changed everything for his family. He'd survived through a combination of courage, luck, and the determination to return home to the people he loved. But he never forgot how quickly an ordinary night of work had turned into a life-or-death struggle, or how many other people might not have been as fortunate as he was. The experience had taught him that evil could strike anywhere at any time, but it had also shown him the power of human resilience in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The Torres family's story became part of Houston's urban folklore, a reminder that heroes could be found in the most unlikely places and that sometimes the bravest battles were fought by ordinary people who simply refused to give up. Michael never drove a taxi again, but he found new purpose in speaking to community groups about personal safety and the importance of supporting victims of violent crime. His daughters grew up knowing that their father was someone who had stared death in the face and lived to tell about it. In the end, Michael Torres's survival stood as a testament to the power of love and determination to overcome even the most desperate circumstances. While he never learned the full truth about why he had been targeted for death, he had won the only victory that truly mattered: the chance to watch his daughters grow up and to grow old with the woman he loved. Sometimes, in a world full of unanswered questions and unpunished crimes, that kind of victory was enough to make the struggle worthwhile.